Good morning. This is the Men's Sunday School class here at Mercy Baptist Church. My name is Robert Rathbone, and we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapters 18, and we're going to skip over into chapter 20, hitting a few verses in each one. Last week we saw David, I was going to say David defeating Goliath, but actually the Lord used David to defeat Goliath. We saw last week it wasn't David's strength, but it was the Lord's strength, that David's dependence on the Lord that gave him the victory over Goliath. So now this week, after seeing David defeat Goliath, King Saul, he sees David as being a valuable man to have in his service. I'm sure he probably believed or thought that maybe David led them to one victory over the Philistines. He may be able to lead them to another, to more victories over the Philistines. And then Saul's son, Jonathan, he sees David as a kindred spirit because Jonathan was a man of faith. He sees David being a man of faith, and so he instantly became friends with David, and they enter a lifelong covenant of friendship between the two of them. But Saul's favor of Jonathan, Saul's favor of David soon turns to jealousy, and he begins seeking opportunities to kill David, and David eventually has to run for his life. And as we'll see next week, Saul will be in hot pursuit trying to find David so he can kill him. But before we get started, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you again for your love, your mercy, your grace, Father, for just dying on the cross for our sins, Father. And Lord, as we study this chapter in David's life, Lord, when Saul's affections toward David turned to jealousy, Father, I pray that you would just teach us, Lord, out of that. Help us to see what we need to see, Father, and learn to love you even more, Father. For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So in chapter 18, we're going to be looking at the first 9 verses here. And this falls right on the heels of last chapter when David returns from killing the giant, Goliath, and he has his head in his hand. So verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass when he made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house." All right. So it says, "And it came to pass when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul," and this is immediately following the last verses of the previous chapter. Because Abner, the captain of the Israeli army, he takes David to see Saul, and it says that David has the head of the Philistine in his hand, so he's fresh from killing Goliath. And Saul asks him who is your father? He wants to know David's background. And so this is coming immediately after that. When he gets done, his interview with Saul is over with. And David begins to, he's leaving the presence of Saul, and he goes on, he's starting to go his way. And it says that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. That word knit there, it means to be bound. In other words, Jonathan, being a man of faith himself, he was impressed by David's faith. because it's very possible he was witness to before David went out, and he heard everything that David said to Saul about, the Lord delivered me out of the hand of the paw of the lion and of the bear, and he's going to deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And so he probably was impressed with David and his faith, and because we saw Jonathan's faith back in chapter 14 when he depended on the Lord to help him and his armor bearer to destroy a garrison of the Philistines. This is 1 Samuel 14, first 14 verses. Because he told the armor bearer, he says, "Hey, the Lord can deliver using just a few, or he can deliver with many." And so he was trusting in the Lord. So now he sees David with that exact same type of faith in the Lord, trusting that the Lord would give him the victory over Goliath. And so Jonathan just felt like David was a kindred spirit. He was knit with the soul of David. He was felt like we're like brothers. Because we share the same faith in the Lord. And then the next line it says, "And David took him that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house." So, if you remember, David at this time he had been recruited because the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul, and this evil spirit from the Lord had come and would torment Saul, put him in a terribly bad mood. And they said, "Let's get somebody to come and play that was skilled with playing the harp, and that could play, and they could soothe you and give you some relief from this evil spirit." And so they got David, and David would play for him on occasion. And apparently he was allowed to come and go. Like when he wasn't playing for Saul, then he could probably go home. Now he's not allowing David to go home. He said, "No, I won't. David, we got a great victory over the Philistines through David. I want David here serving me. I want a man like him that can get things done." I guess I kind of put a little modern spin on it. He saw David as being somebody valuable, and sometimes the world recognizes that people of God, people with their faith in the Lord, are valuable to have around. If you remember what Laban said to Jacob when Jacob was working for Laban, and then for his wives, and then he decided it's time for me to go home, but Laban wanted him to stay. And in Genesis 30, verse 27, Laban told him, he says, "And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry. For I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake." So I'd say Saul had a similar experience there with David. He saw the Lord was with David. The Lord gave them victory over the Philistines because of David. And so he probably thought, I want David to stay here where when the Lord blesses him, I can reap the benefits of that blessing. So verse 3, it says, "Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul." So we're not given specifics of this covenant, of the nature of it, but apparently it was one of friendship and loyalty. We'll see later in this lesson in chapter 20 when they speak of this covenant, and it's going to be a lifelong covenant. It'll be a covenant that even extends to their descendants, that they would be at peace with one another, that they would always be there for each other, that type of thing. And so it's a one of friendship and loyalty. And now some people have tried to give homosexual overtones to this love between Jonathan and David, but it's nothing of the sort. It is just a very good friendship in the Lord. It's a pure love that has no sexual or homosexual overtones to it. This is just friendship between two men who love God, and they love each other because they share that same love for the Lord. In verse 4 it says, "And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David and his garments, even to his sword and to his bow and to his girdle." Now he's stripping off, he's not stripping off naked. He's giving the royal robes. This is how much he thinks of David, how much he cares about David, and he's expressing his friendship and love to him. That he's taking his royal robes and he's saying, "Look, you are equals with me. You're not my servant. I'm not better than you are. I'm giving you the same thing that my privileges I have as being the son of the king, being a prince. I'm giving this to you." So he strips himself of his robe that was upon him, gives it to David, even and his garments, everything that was pertained to his royalty, his position as a prince, the son of the king. It says even to his sword and his bow and to his girdle. So he's giving him all these things, saying, this is how much I care about you. This is how much, this is what our friendship means to me, is that I'm willing to share with you everything that I have. And this, I don't know if Jonathan realizes it or not, but this is a bit prophetic because David himself will eventually become or take Jonathan's place as being the next king. Normally, the king's son becomes the next king at the death of his father. Well, at the death of Saul, David becomes king, not Jonathan. So this is a bit prophetic, him giving, all his, it's almost as if he's transferring, he says, all my rights to be king, after my father, I'm giving that to you. We don't know if he recognizes that or not, but you can see that there. So verse 5, it says, "And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants." All right, and this verse seems to kind of look out into the future, in the coming days, because verse 6 is when they have actually come back from the battle, from slaughtering the Philistines and David killing Goliath. But this verse seems to look ahead, that this is what Saul does for David, and this is what David does. It says, "And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely." So he was in the service of Saul. Saul would send him, I don't know, as a messenger, as a courier, or for whatever, whatever needed to be done. Saul would send David. And it says he behaved himself wisely, and that word wisely, the Hebrew word means to give attention to something, or to be prudent at something. Is the idea that David didn't just halfway or half-heartedly do something. If Saul gave him a task to do, he made sure he did it to the best of his ability. He did it, made sure he completed it and did it properly, did it to the best of his ability. And so David wasn't just haphazard person that did things just enough to get by. He did things. He knew that if the king gave him a task to do, it was important, and so he treated it as such and did it as best as he could. And then that faithfulness was rewarded because Saul set him over the men of war. He gave him positions over probably more experienced soldiers than himself. And so he gave him authority over men in the army. And then it says, "And he was accepted in the sight of all the people and in the sight of Saul's servants." So nobody looked at David and said, "Well, what's this little young whippersnapper coming in here and taking over, and why is Saul putting him over?" They didn't look at it like David like that. He was accepted. they reckoned that, well, I guess they saw, hey, David went down there and fought Goliath. That's something that none of the rest of us was willing to do, and he did that. So they recognized that David belonged there, said he was accepted in the sight of all the people and in the sight of Saul's servants. So they all looked, nobody held a grudge against David that oh, well, he's giving him authority when I was next in line for that position or whatever. They respected David, and they recognized that, well, they respected him because of his victory over Goliath, and they respected him because of his faithfulness to doing his job of whatever Saul told him to do. That he did it. He wasn't just some irresponsible kid doing things. And we're not sure how old David. Well, this was over time, so I'm sure David grew into some of these positions. All right, so verse 6, and it came to pass as they came when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000. So this goes back to now, Saul and David and the rest of the armies of Israel, they're coming back from the battle, from when David slaughtered, or when he killed Goliath, and when Israel slaughtered the Philistines. And so they're returning home, and of course the women come out and they are rejoicing, they're celebrating the victory, and they're singing songs. And this is, and the women answered one another as they played. In other words, there wasn't just one woman that come up with these lyrics. They were singing it back and forth to each other multiple times over and over, and Saul heard it. And they were saying, Saul hath slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. And so this obviously did not set right with Saul. And in effect, they're saying, hey, Saul's a warrior. He can defeat thousands, but David is 10 times the warrior that Saul is, because he could slay 10,000s. And so, obviously, David had become a hero overnight. In verse 8, it says, and Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And he says, what can he have more but the kingdom? All right, so Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. His jealousy and his anger became aroused because of this song. We can see his insecurity and his low self-esteem, because he's not satisfied, that David earned his day in the sun. He's earned a spotlight because he did something. He killed Goliath. Let him have his day in the sun. But Saul was not happy that he wanted to have. He felt like he ought to have more glory than even David. I guess because he's the king. And so his complaint is, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and they have and to me they have ascribed but thousands. So, if you remember, when Israel came to Samuel and said, "We want a king," they said, "We want a king that will fight our battles." Back in 1 Samuel 8:20. Now they're saying the women are singing these songs, and the lyrics say David is essentially 10 times the greater warrior. The king is supposed to be fighting the battles for us. He's supposed to be the warrior, but David's even a greater warrior by a factor of 10 than Saul. And there's that implication there, because they wanted a king to fight their battles, that they're saying David would be a 10 times the better king than Saul was. And so, and I think Saul recognizes that. He says, what more can he have but the kingdom? He says they're saying that he's a better warrior. He says the next step the only thing they can say better about him is giving him the kingdom, and declaring him as the king. And Samuel had already told Saul that the Lord was rejecting him and was going to take the kingdom away from him and give it to a man who he said was better than thou. That's in 1 Samuel 15, verse 28. And now Saul knows that the Lord is no longer with him, but he has noticed that the Lord is with David. So now he's starting to become suspicious. Well, maybe David is the one that Samuel was telling me about, that the Lord is going to take the kingdom from me and give it to him. And so verse 9, it says, and Saul eyed David from that day and forward. So Saul no longer looked at David as just another servant, as somebody that hey, he's a good man, but I've got other servants who are also good men. Now he starts looking at him with a suspicious eye. He's watching. He's thinking, if David is that man that the Lord has chosen to take over, to be the next king, he wanted to keep an eye on it and just watch for these signs of what was going to happen. It's almost the same idea of, I think maybe it was The Godfather, where they say keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Saul wants to keep an eye on David, so he keeps him there with him. And it's also possible that, in those days, kings had to watch out because there would be people who would want to assassinate them and take their place. And so maybe Saul was a little suspicious, what if David was to try to do that? But David is not that kind of a man. In fact, he has the utmost reverence for the Lord's anointed. And we'll see that next week in 1 Samuel 24:6. All right, our book has us skipping now to chapter 20. But to get the context and everything, let me go over the remainder of this chapter. In verses 10 through 30 of this chapter, finishing out this chapter, it says, the next day an evil spirit was tormenting Saul, and David was playing his harp for him to give Saul relief. And then Saul throws his javelin at David, intentionally trying to kill him. And so it said that Saul was recognizing that the Spirit of God had left him and was now with David. And so Saul had become afraid of David. And so he decides to give David authority over 1,000 men. And this would be an assignment that would put David away from him, put some separation between him and Saul. I guess he thought, some physical separation will be safer for me. But this assignment gives more public exposure for David, and as he's doing his faithfully does his duty, people start liking David more and more, and that makes Saul even more afraid of David. Then Saul offers to give David his oldest wife, but David did not consider himself to be worthy to be son-in-law to the king, and so this oldest daughter is eventually given to another man. Then Saul told David he can marry his other daughter, Michal, or Michal, if he brought him the foreskins of 100 Philistines, and he hoped that David probably would get killed when he's trying to collect these foreskins. However, David was able to accomplish this task and marry Michal, or the daughter, and this causes Saul to become even more afraid. So it's like more Saul does, the more afraid he becomes of David. Chapter 19, Saul commanded Jonathan and his servants that they should kill David, but Jonathan reminds his father how the Lord had used David to slay Goliath and thereby bring a great victory over the Philistines. So Saul swore that David would not be killed. However, the next time the evil spirit came upon Saul again and David was playing for him, Saul once again threw his javelin at David, trying to kill him. So David flees for his life, and then Saul sends men to his house to find David and kill him. But Michal, it's Michal, so I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It might be Michal, something like. Anyway, she helps David escape. She points him in the wrong direction. So then David goes to Samuel in Ramah and tells him what Saul has done. Then the two leave together and they go to Naioth. And David sends men to capture David. But when the men arrive, the Lord protects David by causing the men to prophesy. And I think he sends another group, and same thing happens to them. They end up prophesying and not able to get David. So Saul eventually goes himself, and then the same thing happens to him. He ends up prophesying. All right, so now we come to chapter 20, first 40 verses. David flees Naioth and Ramah and comes to Jonathan asking why his father Saul is trying to kill him. He says, look, if I've done something that was worthy of death, he says, you need to kill me. There's no point in you taking me to your father. Kill me yourself if I'm worthy of death. But Jonathan devises a plan to determine if his father still intends to kill David, because Jonathan's skeptical. He's not sure if his father still does want to kill him. So he says, when you don't show up in your place at the supper table tomorrow night, because David always ate with Saul, he says, we'll look at how my father reacts, and if it doesn't matter to him, then we know he doesn't care. It's not that he doesn't want to kill you, but if he reacts angrily, then we'll know that he does intend on killing you, and I'll report back to you secretly. And the secret way they was going to do it, he said, I'll come back to this field where we're talking. I'll bring a lad with bows and arrows, and I'll shoot the arrows out like I'm practicing. Send the boy out after him, and if my father doesn't want to kill you, then I'll say, hey, you've passed the arrows; they're back on this side of you. If he is angry with you and wants to kill you, then I'll tell the boy to keep going. The arrows are still beyond you. And so that's what they did. And Saul reacts angrily when David's not there, because I guess he felt like he was missing an opportunity to kill David. And so Jonathan report comes back to that field with the arrows and does like they agreed to do, and tells him, hey, the arrows are beyond you. And so he sends the lad back with the arrows, and leaving Jonathan and David alone. And he does that so that he and David can talk privately. So that finally brings us to 1 Samuel 20, verse 41. It says, and as soon as the lad was gone, David arose out of a place toward the south and fell on his face to the ground and bowed himself 3 times. And they kissed one another and wept with one another until David exceeded. All right, so David comes out of after that boy has left, David comes out of his hind place to meet with Jonathan. And notice he bows himself 3 times in humility and respect to Jonathan. And then they kiss one another in friendship. They weep with one another because I'm sure they think this could be the last time we get to see one another. And it says until David exceeded, and that is he wept more than Jonathan did. But I guess they wept with one another until they till they become emotionally exhausted. Because these are 2 close friends who are about to go their separate ways, and they're probably brokenhearted over the circumstances of why this is happening. And so verse 42, and Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for as much as we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. All right. And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went to the city. All right, so notice Jonathan said to David, go in peace. He's saying, look, my father may have something against you. My father may hate you and want to kill you, but you, as far as me and you are concerned, go in peace. We have I bear you no ill will. And then he says, for as much as we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord. He says, I bear you no ill will, and we have both sworn in the name of the Lord. They made that covenant that we saw earlier in the lesson. And he says, saying, this is what the covenant, or what we have sworn. He says, the Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. So essentially saying, the Lord would stand as witness between the two of them, that they have sworn this covenant of friendship, then they would be friends forever, not only during their lifetime, but their descendants after them would still have that bond of friendship, that covenant of friendship between the descendants of Jonathan and the descendants of David. And we see that play out later because one of Jonathan's sons, Mephibosheth, not Methuselah, Mephibosheth, and David, when he discovers that Mephibosheth, or the existence of Mephibosheth, he brings Mephibosheth into his house and basically takes care of him for the rest of his life. Keeps him up, makes sure he has food, and takes care of him, supports him for the rest of his life because of that covenant between him and Jonathan. And so it says, and he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So after they finish and say their goodbyes, then David leaves to go running for his life, to make himself scarce and get away from where Saul can't find him. And then Jonathan goes home, returns to his city. Now next week, we will see just the lengths that Saul is willing to go to try to hunt down David and try to capture him and no doubt subsequently kill him. But the Lord takes care of David. He makes sure that David stays just out of reach, and then even when they do get close enough, the Lord gives David an opportunity where if David had chosen to, he could have killed, well, on 2 occasions, he could have killed Saul. But David has the utmost reverence to the one that the Lord has chosen to be king, and that would be Saul. And he says, look, I will not raise my hands against the Lord's anointed. So we'll see that David shows himself to be a man of honor. In fact, you look on further out where Saul, he's holding on to the idea of him being king with both hands, and it's like if he even suspects that David might be the one that's going to take over, he's jealous of him and wants to kill him. David, on the other hand, if you remember when his son Absalom launches the coup against him and to try to take the kingdom from him, and he's run out of Jerusalem, he's leaving, and the man comes out and he's throwing rocks at him. He says, I'm loosely paraphrasing, but he's saying, look, you're getting what you deserve, David. And one of David's men says, let me go over there and I'll separate the man's head from his body, for insulting the king like this. And David says, look, he says, maybe the Lord told him to say that, and if the Lord wants to bring me back as king, he will. If he don't, then, that's fine. He was submissive to the Lord's will. That's not what Saul is doing. Saul is trying his best to hold on. The one he sees as a threat to his kingdom, to him being king, he's going after David, trying to get rid of him. So that shows you a contrast between David and Saul. So we'll pick up there next week.